Well, good evening, and let's get started. Welcome to the University of Oregon in Portland at the White Stag Block. Delighted you're here with us this evening. My name is Al Stavitsky, and I'm the director of the Turnbull Center, which is the UO School of Journalism and Communications program here. We're up on the third floor, and we're one of the sponsors of this evening's event of poetry and journalism. Archibald MacLeish once wrote that young poets are advised by their elders to avoid the practice of journalism as they would wet socks and gin before breakfast. Yet we find that Coleridge and Kipling worked for newspapers, as did a young editor whose byline read Walter Whitman. In the summer of 2009, the Israeli newspaper Haaretz turned its pages over for a day to 31 of Israel's leading poets and authors and said, go ahead, cover the news your way. My favorite of those reports was the stock market summary, which was written by a popular children's book author in Israel, and it went like this. Everything's okay. Everything's like usual. Yesterday trading ended. Everything's okay. The economists went to their homes. The laundry is drying on the lines. Dinners are waiting in place. Dow Jones traded steadily and closed with 8,761 points. NASDAQ added 0.9% to a level of 1,860. And the guy from the shakshuka shop, that's an Israeli egg dish, the guy from the shakshuka shop raised his prices again. And that was the stock market summary. Well, one more. The weather report was headlined Summer Sonnet. Summer is the pencil that is least sharp in the season's pencil case. That was the weather report. Just one more note. This year at Wordstock, I heard a Spokane author named Jess Walter read from his novel, The Financial Lives of the Poets. Did anybody catch that? That's. Are you reading the book now? I won't spoil it, except to say I'm sure you're this far that his. I won't say anything that wasn't wouldn't be in the reviews or all. But the protagonist in that book is reduced to selling marijuana to support his family because he went broke running a website that offered financial news in verse. And so I went up to Jess Walter afterwards, and I told him about this event. And he chuckled. He was intrigued by the notion. I said, "Well, why don't you come and join us?" But he was in Toronto on his book tour and couldn't come. But he said he thought it would be fun, and I think it will be fun. So we are going to have some fun with this and have two wonderful guides today. Before I introduce them, let me acknowledge our sponsors for this event. There's of course my shop, the George S. Turnbull Center of the UO School of Journalism and Communication. There's the UO Portland Library and Learning Commons, the UO's Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, and our friends at Literary Arts. So thanks all for putting this together. And now, our presenters. Paulann Petersen was appointed Oregon's 6th Poet Laureate by Governor Kulongoski last April. As Poet Laureate, she travels the state as an ambassador of poetry. She is a Portland native and a lifelong Oregonian, and while living with her family in Klamath Falls, she was inspired by the high plateau landscape and began writing poetry. Her first published poem appeared in The Oregonian, so that connection again. And since then, of course, she's published numerous books and chapbooks, and her poems have been published in numerous literary magazines. And I enjoy her work most mornings on the bus as part of TriMet's Poetry in Motion program. I should note Paulann's appearance is made possible by the Oregon Poet Laureate program, which is a collaborative project of the state's 5 cultural partners, the Oregon Arts Commission, Oregon Humanities, Oregon Heritage Commission, the Oregon Historical Society, the State Historic Preservation Office, and plus there is funding from the Oregon Cultural Trust, so thanks to all of them. And Don Colburn is with us. Don is a freelance journalist and poet in Portland. He worked for 4 newspapers during a distinguished reporting career, including the Washington Post and the Oregonian, and he was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in feature writing. Don became interested in poetry while on a mid-career Knight Fellowship at Stanford, and since then his poems have been published widely. His 3rd collection of poetry, a chapbook titled Because You Might Not Remember, will appear next month. And I should note that both Paulann and Don are board members of the Friends of William Stafford group, which organizes those wonderful birthday celebrations around town. So please join me in welcoming Paulann Petersen and Don Colburn.
I'm going to go first, I guess, because I'm not quite sure why, because I'm the journalist poet, I guess. I too read the reports of that Israeli newspaper experiment. I had a different favorite from Al, so I'll just say my favorite part was the TV review by Eshkol Nevo. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right. He opened his TV report that day with, "I didn't watch TV yesterday."
And that was it?
Okay. I think that was just the opening.
Okay.
I think he had other things to say. I'm going to kick this off with a poem that I didn't write and that Paulann didn't write and that William Carlos Williams didn't write. Someone named J. Leeming wrote this poem, and it's in his book with the promising title, Dynamite on a China Plate. I think you'll see quickly why I picked it.
People who know what they're doing are.
As opposed to me.
No, I'm referring to me.
On their own. They're on their way. That's always
See if this works better. Okay. All right, this is a poem by J. Leeming called Man Writes Poem. This just in, a man has begun writing a poem in a small room in Brooklyn. His curtains are apparently blowing in the breeze. We go now to our man Harry on the scene. What's the story down there, Harry? Well, Chuck, he has begun the 2nd stanza and seems to be doing fine. He's using a blue pen. Most poets these days use blue or black ink, so blue is a fine choice. His curtains are indeed blowing in a breeze of some kind, and what's more, the radiator is whistling somewhat. No metaphors have been written yet, but I'm sure he's rummaging around down there in the tin cans of his soul, and will turn up something for us soon. Hang on, just breaking news here, Chuck. There are birds singing outside his window, and a car with a bad muffler has just gone by. Yes, definitely a confirmation on the singing birds. Excuse me, Harry, but the poem seems to be taking on a very auditory quality at this point, wouldn't you say? Yes, Chuck, you're right, but after years of experience, I would hesitate to predict exactly where this poem is going. Why, I remember being on the scene with Frost in 47 and with Stevens in 53, and if there's one thing about poems these days, it's that, hang on, something's happening here. He has just compared the curtains to his mother. And he has described the radiator as, quote, roaring deep with the red walrus of history. Now that's a key line, especially appearing here, somewhat late in the poem, when all of the similes are about to go home. In fact, he seems a bit knocked out with the effort of writing that line, and who wouldn't be? Looks like, yes, he's put down his pen and has gone to brush his teeth. Back to you, Chuck. Well, thanks, Harry. Wow, the life of the artist. That's it for now, but we'll keep you informed of more details as they arise. I think the news in that poem is rather frightening, isn't it, for all of us, I think? For 33 years, I made my living as a newspaper reporter, writing prose. I didn't pay much attention to poetry until I was nearly 40. No disrespect, I admired poets from afar. I just didn't think they had much to do with my work or my life. After all, I was a newspaper guy, reporting on the real world. Plus, I was pretty sure poems were impossible to write. Now I know better. I also know that poetry has made me a better prose writer, a better news reporter. Walt Whitman, whom Al already mentioned, and is better known to us as the great American poet than he is as newspaper editor for the Brooklyn Eagle, said in 1852, "The true poem is the daily paper." Now, I don't know about you, but I don't quite believe that. You can't always trust Whitman any more than you can always trust any writer or any newspaper editor. This is, after all, a man who reviewed his own poetry in his own newspaper anonymously. And need I say, favorably. I'm not even sure that Walt himself would think of his daily paper as a true poem, although I think I know what he meant. I think he meant that he wanted a poetry that gets out of the classroom into the streets. I think he meant that nothing is off limits to poetry. And I think he wanted a poetry that, like his own ego, contained multitudes. So let's grant Whitman his poetic license, and let's also acknowledge some differences between poetry and journalism. I want to be clear about this. There are some journalists in the audience, and just in case any of my colleagues from the Oregonian think that I have indeed gone over to the dark side, journalists aren't supposed to make things up. Novelists and poets often do, but they don't write on deadline, usually. Most news stories are in the third person. A lot of poems aren't. In prose, the computer or the page margin decides where the end of the line comes. And in a poem, the writer does. And I think non-poets may not realize what a difference that makes. In news writing, you try to know what you're going to say before you try to say it. In a poem, I've learned you try not to. But think for a moment in this context of what poetry and journalism have in common, starting with words and the human condition. Also, concision and precision and clarity, I would say. To my mind, these sharings outweigh any logistical differences having to do with print and fact-checking and deadlines and the shapes of lines. What's more, the two kinds of writing can inform each other. I think paying closer attention to the sound and the play of language and the nuances of words can help a news story come closer to the truth. I think poetry is not an escape from the world, but another way of apprehending it. I love the quote from William Carlos Williams that is on the poster here. I wanted to mention another few lines from a different poem that William Carlos Williams wrote called January Morning, which is addressed to an old woman, possibly his mother. I wanted to write a poem that you would understand. For what good is it to me if you can't understand it? But you got to try hard. And now I'm going to read a couple of poems. This first one I wrote, and it started, I think, that is the writing. It's started where the poem now ends, with a photograph, a dramatic photograph on the front page of the New York Times and many other newspapers almost a couple of years ago. You probably all saw it in some form. It was when that plane crash landed in the Hudson River, piloted by a guy named Sullenberger. In the unlikely event of a water landing, U.S. Airways Flight 1549. When the pilot told us to, I couldn't take my glasses off and put my head down between my knees. I wanted to watch to the last moment before smithereens. Closing your eyes won't help, not like in music. The eerie part wasn't death touching down early, but how quiet it was, how smooth. We were gliding, the buzz and rumble of engines gone, and I could hear everything. The crying, less than you think, Hail Marys, the man up front trying against the rules to call home. An old woman many rows back sang beautifully in Spanish, maybe to God. I don't speak that language. I wish I had known they called the captain Sully, and how Sully was a glider pilot, too. We had no idea why it was happening, no inkling of geese or gulls, but we were losing altitude, and the quiet sounded terribly wrong. After we banked left, Sully brought us down easy onto the river. The trick is to ride the thickening air down slow and plow into the water, head up like a duck, not to nosedive, jackknife, cartwheel, burn. When we didn't die, some panicked. Suddenly there was time, and ice water sloshing at our ankles, our knees. How long can a heavier-than-air machine float? Someone named Josh knew to knock the door out over the wing. I didn't notice the guy carrying his garment bag or the lady screaming for her shoes. I just remember getting pushed toward a hole in the side of the plane and tumbling out into the cold, gray, blinding afternoon which held me. I came to my feet on the submerged wing with the others, and we walked on water. As a journalist, maybe this is obvious, but it really wasn't obvious to me. It was so liberating to be able to presumptuously assume the voice of someone else and still, I think, keep the poem true to the facts which I read in the newspaper. All of those facts in there, I mean, all of those details, I didn't make up. I'm not that imaginative, but they're in there, and they came from the newspaper. I'm going to stick in here a short poem, a little poem by William Stafford from his book Passwords. News every day. Birds don't say it just once. If they like it, they say it again. And again, every morning. I heard a bird congratulating itself all day for being a jay. Nobody cared, but it was glad all over again and said so again. Many people are fighting each other in the world. You could learn that and say, many people are fighting each other in the world. It would be true, But saying it wouldn't make any difference. But you'd say it. Birds are like that. People are like that. And then one more, because it also originated with me reading the newspaper. Another front page story. And this one is in a form which doesn't matter, but I'll just tell you so you don't think I'm being redundant in the poem. It's called a villanelle. It has complicated rules that I don't remember and couldn't explain to you about repetition and rhyme. So there's a lot of repetition and rhyme, which I think you'll hear. But this is called Outside the AIDS Clinic in Uganda. A woman sits beneath a tree and cries. She came by bus 4 hours to be turned away. She can't get on the list until another dies. She's 28, too weak to walk, her eyes a channel back to what they've seen today, which makes her sit beneath a tree and cry. There was a time when antiviral drugs gave rise to hope, and big bucks donors found their way, but now you can't get on the list till someone dies. To save a life takes money, time, supplies. The woman, having none, can only pray. She sits alone beneath the tree and cries. Each day 100 more. The doctor tries to find more comforting words to say, you can't get on the list till someone dies. Her face is just one face of grief the size of a lost country, hers, or ours a world away. A woman sits beneath a tree and cries. She can't get on the list until another dies. Thank you. All yours.
Oh, that front, this isn't on, is it? Exit for it. Is that it? No? What? Oh, all right, but you need to get really close to it. Okay, is that going to pick up? All right. That front page news, Don Colburn. And I saw when I came up here and sat down, there was a photocopy of an article. Is that something that you wrote about cross-training? I think he's been cross-training for a long time between journalism and poetry. That William Carlos Williams, and that is from a wonderful poem, Asphodel, that greeny flower. And that asphodel is the flower that supposedly grew in the underworld, if I'm not mistaken. I think that's right. So, William Carlos Williams, yeah, how do you get the news from poems? Maybe the news in a poem is something as simple as the urgency, the music of urgency. From afar. Oh, quick step, breakneck, rambler, loose limb, move in a little closer. Fire my face with my own chagrin, start my throat pumping with the rat-a-tat of your flicker fan hands. One step out, one step in, shim, shim, shimmer skin, give me another little sip of your fine honeysuckle sweet from the flower mouth wine. Maybe the news in a poem is the news of problem solving. Had a friend who owned a house, an old farmhouse in Oregon City, and a beautiful place kind of out a ways from Oregon City, and slowly but surely one of the outside walls filled with bees. Bees took up residence between, the siding, the outside siding, and the inside wall of the living room. And his daughter was allergic to bee stings, so that was quite a problem to solve. Pragmatics. In your story of bees, they slowly fill an outside wall, 3 stud spaces wide, 2 stories high, in the front bay of your old farmhouse. You first try all the poisons, even your pickup set to run all day, its exhaust piped into a hole in the wall, while you go away, hoping the fumes will kill them. But no. So, on a winter's icy morning, you pull the siding off and scrape out, story by tall story, thick clots of comb and honey, clumps of stiff, chilled bees. They had to go, no question. But tell me again, please, how you stood inside and breathed in summer's reckless heat the fragrance of their work, wild perfume of wax and flower. Say again how you pressed your ear tight to the wall, heard the house humming, its blur of countless wings, a fine, even tremble. Maybe the news that you can get from a poem might be a kind of a history lesson, and maybe a set of instructions to go along with it. In ancient cultures, in many ancient cultures, a solar eclipse was seen as a catastrophe, a real catastrophe. People saw a solar eclipse as evidence of the sun being destroyed, and they took action to do something about it. Solar eclipse. In case of murder, some devil or dragon devouring the sun, make a racket of wails and whooping shouts. Bang on copper plates you've polished to mirrors. Send enough hubbub out and up to scare the demon into dropping its prey. Then again, it could be love. The moon's legs wrapped around the sun's thick hips. In case of such a mating, heat escaping their locked bodies, that visible ring of flares huge in the sky. Don't even yip. Play it safe. Look the other way. It might be that the news in a poem is an answer to a question you've never asked. Why the world isn't flat. Water would have no place to travel. Rivers would have no beds. Oceans, no ebb and go. The stream you're beside would have staggered and stymied long ago. No fine rapids chatter. Leaf boats sailing along? Gone. No downhill song for former rain to croon. No need for the fingerling trout to make its swing-muscled swim against the flow. And it might be that the news found in a poem is an answer to the mystery of why a teenage daughter is so contrary, so difficult. This poem, this news, maybe this actually, that whole thing with teenage daughters, this might be front page news. This poem alludes to a natural phenomenon that we can note, although we cannot note it as clearly as people were able to ages ago, because we don't see as much of the night sky now as we used to. Ambient light, city light, obscures a great deal of what's in the night sky for us. But this can be noted, and it was certainly noted by ancient peoples for eons, generations, and that is that in the night sky, the moon appears to move in a direction opposite that of the stars. Bloodline. The moon is wet nurse to roses. She suckles each soft-mouthed poppy. Blame her for menses. Rail at her for the craving to binge and purge. Please her when you choose to delay the day for planting, biding your time until night has fattened her silver torso. Praise her when the fleck of seed poked down into damp dark takes hold and swells. Any girl child is always her offspring. Upbraid her for your daughter's sass and door slams, that hot hurry to be what most differs from you. Long ago, the moon decided on a pathway against the route stars take. No one else would dare to walk the black sky backward. Well, I have been thinking a lot hear the last few days about the news that poems can deliver to us, even if that news is, as William Carlos Williams said, difficult. And I too would like to call on a poem from Bill Stafford. This is Bill Stafford's poem called Reading the Big Weather. It is from A Scripture of Leaves. Reading the Big Weather. Mornings we see our breath. Weeds sturdy for winter are waiting down by the tracks. Birds high and silent pass, almost invisible over town. Time, always almost ready to happen, leans over our shoulders reading the headlines for something not there. Republicans control Congress. The year spins on, unheeding. The moon drops back toward the sun, a sickle gone faint in the dawn. There is a weather of things that happen too faint for headlines, but tremendous, like willows touching the river. This earth we are riding keeps trying to tell us something with its continuous scripture of leaves. Oh, that metaphor, those headlines about things that, or something that, things that are too faint for headlines, but tremendous, like the willow touching the river. Those are the front page news stories from poems. When I was thinking about what journalism does, what poetry does, I thought a lot about where journalism starts. And it seems to me that journalism starts with a notion, an impulse of what will be news for many, what will be of interest for many people, what is important for many people to know, a kind of news for the majority. And that seems to me where a journalist might start in terms of choosing what he or she was going to write about, find out about, research. And poetry works a little differently. If journalism is news for a majority, poetry is news by way of epiphany. Poetry is that news that springs from what we might call that lyric impulse, epiphany, discovery, some sort of announcement that the world is making to the self, or the self makes, speaks sort of to itself, and then the impulse is to write it. So, as with Don, you were talking about the things that you thought that poetry and journalism had in common, and I started thinking of Venn diagrams. Does everybody know what I'm talking about when I say a Venn diagram? Those wonderful circles, and you look at, you have set A, that would be journalism, and set B, that would be poetry, and what those two sets have in common. I did think of compression. In poetry, I think of it as more of compression in terms of sort of torque, sort of energy. Compression, am I remembering incorrectly from my scant training in anything having to do with journalism, but isn't there still the pyramid, the journalistic pyramid, you know, the story where what gets in the paper or what gets in is the top part of that pyramid, and depending on how much room, how many column inches there are, they... Come on, Don, this is when you...
Down. I should call on my colleagues
Yeah.
out there are smiling because they've been trying to overturn that that already inverted pyramid for their entire careers. But yes, you're right. It still exists, and it's pretty time honored.
So that's a kind of different compression, because you're going to start out with what is most essential, and then reach out a little bit, and hope that as much of that reaching out gets into the story as possible, right?
Well, it goes back to the days when it was harder to tell how much space there was for a story because it wasn't a computer doing that. It was a fallible human being instead of a fallible computer, I might say. But so stories were actually cut from the bottom. That was the easiest way.
Yeah.
So if you have the inverted pyramid, it's actually upside down.
Oh.
So that the least important material, which would be at the bottom, would just be lopped. But of course, no one tells a story that way.
No, and poems don't work that way.
And poems don't work that way.
Poems don't work that way.
So, anyway.
It might, not be until the very end of a poem that you would get to what is essential, what is the most important. I thought about music. For me, a poem is a creature of sound. It is part of the oral tradition. A poem has music. It has musical devices, things that feed your ear. And whether you realize it or not, analyze it or not, you physically respond to the music in a poem. You kinetically respond to it. So I thought about the music in journalism. And actually what I thought of was that music that one achieves with a beautiful architecture of a sentence, balance, architecture in sentences, that's a kind of music.
Alas, it's a lot of noise, too. I'm thinking, I want to say it before anyone here does.
What?
But yes, in any good sentence, there's music. The urgency of music, or the music. Did you say urgency of music, or music of urgency?
Yeah, sure. I said
both.
Yeah. I didn't, but I'll happily take that. Yeah. No, I talked about some poems, the news of some poems might simply be an urgency of music, yeah. So, and I thought about trope, which simply means figurative language. Most poets use figurative language a great deal. Simile, metaphor, hyperbole, synecdoche, metonymy. They're using language that cannot be taken literally. There are master poets who say, Diane Wachowski says, if it doesn't have trope, if it doesn't have figurative language, as far as she's concerned, it's not a poem. So that's something very basic to most poems. So I thought, okay, I've got that. I've got that one lined out. Journalists don't use figurative language. They don't use trope. Are we agreeing out there? Are we disagreeing? What do you say, cross-trainer?
Well, I never knew what trope was, so now I know. Just reminds me of tripe. That's my problem.
Oh, come on.
I can't help it, but that's...
Yes, you can help it.
Yeah.
You can do something about that.
I think journalists do use figurative language. The trouble is that Well, it's a fine line between figurative language and figurative language that's worked so well that it becomes a cliche. And we use a lot of that too.
Well,
Because
yeah.
guess what? Cliches are understandable and we all
Mhm.
get them. But sometimes we don't have time to think up figurative language on deadline, I think. So we'll probably opt for the literal, or our editors will opt for the literal if they're afraid that we're reaching too far for, we don't, in a poem, it's quite wonderful if someone has to read it twice, I think, not more than twice, but I would say twice at least, or wants to go back to the poem to read it over and over again to get more and more meaning out of it. My editors at the newspaper really didn't think much of that logic when it came to newspaper articles, and I think they would be right. So the default position, I think, in newspaper writing would be toward that sort of clarity. I think poems rely on a kind of clarity too. I feel fiercely about that. Not everyone would agree, but mystery is fine in a poem. Mystery in a newspaper article, maybe. Certainly not mystification in either one. But I think even mystery is a bit of a problem in the newspaper. And of course, it depends on what sort of article we're talking about, or story. Nope. Figurative language.
Well,
Trope.
okay, but,
I learned a new
did-
word tonight.
Yeah.
Trope. Trope.
But thinking about figurative language, and as I say, I thought, okay, I've come up with something where there's this real line dividing, the journalists from the poets. And all of a sudden I realized, as at least this language, the English language, as speakers of this language, we cannot scrub metaphor out of the language. It is almost impossible. I mean, would a journalist not say she cupped her hands? That's a metaphor. And it's so embedded in the language that we do not even see it as a metaphor. Would a journalist not refer to a table's leg? That's a metaphor. Or the hands of a clock. All, there is so much metaphor that is so deeply embedded in, or someone darting across the room. Metaphor. So that's not the kind of line that I thought, really divisive line between poetry and journalism, between poets and
Or
journalists,
any
that I thought
sport,
it might make.
any sports headline almost. That you can
Oh
think
my
of.
God.
Including of course I can't think of one right now, but almost the triply mixed metaphors whenever you have teams that already start out as a mixed metaphor, like the Los Angeles Lakers, which doesn't make sense, but if, would they...
Lakers douse
Blazers.
so-and-so.
No, I didn't say that. No, the other way around.
But yeah, that is true. Headlines. And what, am I remembering the kind of a kicker, the sub-headline? No?
Kicker usually, to me, means the ending of a story. Kicker is kind of like, this is the problem with the old style of editing from the bottom, or we used to say in the old days, now I'm really sounding like old media, bite your story from the bottom. They just lop off the ending. Well, if a story has, let's say, a beginning, a middle, and an ending, and the ending goes, it's not much of a story. And good story would end with maybe a kicker.
Okay.
Maybe you're thinking subhead, maybe?
Well,
or
what
how-
is the
what are we
what is
talking
the
about
term
here?
for
You
you've got a
guys.
headline
We got
and
some
then you've
pros
got
out
kind
there.
of
The deck. Thank you.
a sub headline. What's the term for that?
Deck.
The deck.
There's
Okay.
a metaphor.
There's a metaphor. Yeah. Well, anyway, if I get to be a journalist, I want to write kickers. I want to write decks.
Kick-ass kickers.
Woo.
Yeah.
Al, are you ready to be? Yeah, here he goes.
I'm going to do my Phil Donahue thing.
Stand back.
So, well, we wanted to open it up. Let me take the moderator's prerogative, though, and ask the first question. And Don, you sort of alluded to this at the beginning in your remarks, but now at a time with newspapers struggling, I mean, what can journalists learn from poets that might help revive newspapers?
Wow. I hear my friend Joe Soldati say grammar would help. Probably not sales, right? I mean, I think, I feel like, I've gone from one endangered species to another and adopted both. Wow. The news, I guess, remembering that, I guess I agree with William Carlos Williams that a poem, to be successful, has to bear some news. It has to carry some news, whether it's musical news or beauty, a kind of news, or emotional urgency, a kind of news. And those are the kinds of stories that I think will connect with not only the minority, but to pick up on something Paulann said, a majority or larger numbers of readers. The trouble is that that's in the eye of the beholder. And, well, I was struck by this last weekend. Every Saturday in the Oregonian, the print version of the Oregonian, it prints the top 10 stories from the online version of the Oregonian during the previous week. Top 10 meaning the most popular, the ones with the most hits, the most clicks, the most views. And here's the top 10 from last Saturday. I don't know what to make of this, so I'm kicking the answer back to you. But Portland's 10 top stories online from OregonLive.com. Number 1, Portland police surprised by topless woman with a meat cleaver. Five out of the remaining 9 had to do with different versions, iterations of the Chiron story. Maybe no surprise there. Which carries a kind of news, whether you regard it as over-reported or not. So 5 of them are different versions of that. The other 4 are Portland police panel finds Captain Mark Kruger brought discredit and disgrace upon the city by erecting a memorial to Nazi soldiers. Portland marathoners run in the rain, basically. And I think the one remaining other one was number 5. Portland man finds stranger in his bathtub coated in mud wearing his Ducks jersey. So I don't know if that's a majority or a minority, but it's that's a kind of news too, dare I say it. And I don't know what to make of that. It's not. Most of those stories were, as it were, news to me when I read them in the Saturday listing there. But somebody clicked on them a lot. Or else it's one guy clicking over and over and over again. I could hope.
Well,
I don't
when
know.
you say click, it means that they go there to read that story, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
They at least glance at it.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know. There's a lot we don't know. And I think the I don't know is the place where both newspaper stories and poems always begin.
When we talk about music and poetry, we should keep in mind the area of silence. and that wasn't mentioned. I was hoping you would say that, especially when we get through with the rhythmic clause on it. But silence is completely, especially now. We need more of that, and I just feel like I just wanted to say that.
And there are just physically the way a poem sits on the page with so much more white space than what we would think of, if we thought of a block of prose. That white space is silence, too, is that quietness around the words, sort of buoying the words.
It's not our strong point in the media, I would say, silence. I'm thinking back to that guy writing the poem, beginning to write, the poet, the man beginning to write a poem in a small room in Brooklyn. You kind of want to just let him go about that in silence, but of course, Harry, or was it Chuck, or both of them, couldn't allow that to happen.
I'm an epistemological skeptic. That is, I don't think we know much about much. The only certainty I know is that we don't know anything. But in that context, poetry is so magic. The pretenses that we make of certainty and absoluteness and religion and science is a myth, and it's wrong. We need to fly and float and enjoy one another, our minds, our insights, and so on. So that's why I think, anyway, that's what I think.
Thank you.
I would, by the way, make a pitch for uncertainty and or certainly ambiguity, maybe even confusion as a ripe subject for journalism. Underrated. There's a lot against it. I mean, sort of logistically, when you're a reporter trying to sell a story to an editor who's trying to sell it to another editor who's trying to get it into the paper the next day, it can sound like you're just throwing your hands up and you don't really know anything about anything when you say it. But
We live our lives in illusion, and I think you guys help that out. You contribute.
I wouldn't disagree.
I would like to offer that perhaps journalism owes its early foundation to poets in the form of the troubadours who, traveled from place to place, from great house to great house, with their created stories based on, with, I'm sure, a little poetic license thrown in, but based on a certain battle, a certain king. So perhaps this journalism does owe that to early poets.
Yeah.
I agree. I mean, they used to spread the news from town to town. And they used rhyme in order to remember it. Yes. I wanted to say that I remember being in Jerusalem, and every day there would be a poem in the newspaper. And I remember being there with Yehuda Machai, Israeli poet, and he says, "Come on, friend, let's go get a cup of coffee. I got to get my newspaper because my poem's going to be in there today." And that the people of Jerusalem expected a poem every day with their morning coffee. But I also wanted to come back to your question earlier about what can poetry offer journalism in terms of more readers. Well, I don't know if this is, would result in more readers, but I think one of the things that differentiates the news, journalism, at least investigative reporting and the hard news, maybe not feature writing, from poetry is that in poetry we use a lot of the senses, and we come at an event with the senses. For example, if there's a traffic accident, the journalist reports it a certain way, who, what, where, when, why, and the poet comes at it perhaps from the point of view of the smell of the gasoline, the heat of the rubber on the street, from the tires, there's a sense of presence in a poem that the journalist may not have the time or the editor to allow. So I think when you bring the senses into a piece of writing, it draws in the reader. You're there. You're there. And so I think that's one of the ways that a piece of news can break through the reader's denial and perhaps add more readers.
I'd like to say something about, I think, writers, poets, and journalists have in common, and that they're all hookers. That is, they look for a hook. And Paulann and Don, I know your individual poems well enough, and other writers and other poets too. And as a writer and a poet and a former journalist, you look for something to engage your reader, whether you're writing about a train wreck, or you're writing an editorial, or a feature story, or a poem. And good writers and good poets, and I do believe in I think of you both as excellent poets, but you hook me in the first line or two, and that keeps me reading the poem. But that's also true of a newspaper story. The police confronting the woman with the cleaver is interesting and bizarre, and I don't think you need the headline enough is hook enough. And that headlines, by the way, are the first hook whereas in a poem the title might not be. But Melville, Dickens were great hookers, and yes, writers have something in common with the oldest profession. I used to tell my students that writers, journalists, poets, novelists have one thing in common with the oldest profession. They're all hookers. And I'm sure like you've turned a newspaper down, a story away, because it didn't grab you. The first paragraph doesn't grab you. Now the heck with it. And the same thing, that's true of a news story, editorial, also a feature. It's also true of poetry. Why do I keep some books and not others?
I disagree entirely about that.
Where was the? There was.
I'm in no hurry.
And then we'll go. And then okay. So there's.
Well, I think the definition of news that I heard, or I think we're presuming, is that something that is news is new and worth knowing about. So in that sense, I think a good news story and a good poem are kind of the same thing, or are very similar. I think those of us who write for a living, journalists, a newscast or a newspaper is a product. It's something that you want to do the best you can to get the most people to read or to listen to or to click into. So I think if we speak of a news story, it's something that's new and worth knowing, or newly phrased and worth appreciating, like a good poem. So that's the difference I see. And in your list of the 10 most hit upon news stories, it's what attracts the most eyeballs or the most most screen hits. So it's what a good story is, and it's what the product is. You still have a newspaper to fill or a 4 o'clock news to fill, so you've got to put something in there, and it isn't always, or maybe even often, journalism. Yeah.
Aren't newspapers a form of poetry?
Al, could I add something here just for a second? Poe, Edgar Allan Poe, in a wonderful essay about the short story, very early in the short story's life evolution, talks about the reader as co-creator. I love that. The idea of the reader bringing to the poem, the short story, the article in the newspaper, that energy and commitment to be a co-creator to that. And what I'm thinking is, as readers, wouldn't we be bringing different, different skills, attitudes to a newspaper article than we would to a poem or a short story. In a newspaper article, I wouldn't necessarily be looking to be immediately drawn in. If I were there for information, if I were there to be educated, to be informed about something, I would hope that I would have a great deal of patience, that I would be willing to invest a certain amount of patience in reading this article that was going to inform me about an issue that in which I were interested, to be that kind of co-creator.
Being from a younger generation, I appreciate poetry much more than newspapers, and a lot of people may find that kind of baffling, but I actually don't ever read the newspaper. I never really go online to find out, certain things that happened in the news, and one could say I'm very disconnected or disenchanted with certain aspects of our current generation, but I do really like the idea of including poems in the newspaper, and Street Roots, Portland's local paper, actually does that, and I submitted a poem once that actually got accepted, and it was very humbling, because here are people who really, are passionate about out there selling these papers on the street corner just so that they can get something to eat. And I just also wanted to add a quote of Henry David Thoreau's concerning the newspaper. I can't remember it exactly, so it's a little bit paraphrased, but he goes on to say, "The people who read the newspapers daily are in a similar condition to the dog who returns to lap up his vomit." And I thought, as graphic and as horrible as it might seem, it kind of captures the idea that we really return to the things that are least important to in these newspapers. But yeah, I just wanted to thank you. Yeah, I just feel like poetry is more important than a lot of these things that they kind of keep us subdued with.
Well, even though I realize that poems can go on for volumes, or at least a volume, and can be very long, it seems that one of the things that journalism could take from poetry is brevity. When we're talking about transmitting our thoughts in 140 characters, I get so impatient with newspaper articles. I'm surprised in your poem about the poet sitting down to write, the two newscasters didn't say, "Oh, and now we're going to interview the neighbor. Oh, I'm sorry, the neighbor isn't available, but it seems her sister-in-law is here. Do you have anything to say?" And there is so much.
That sounds more like local TV than it.
But even in the printed word, there's so much, so-and-so quoted, and here we have on the scene, I mean, I know I'm sounding like a live broadcast, but in fact, it's also in the written word every day that you have this, and always it has to be the age. And 37-year-old Dawn McGillicuddy, who's also a plumber, is now going to say his thoughts on the traffic jam. And there's so much extra fluff, and I don't know if it is trying to fill, because what the last speaker just said is that so much of it is junk, I'm sorry. But we want to know also what's happening in the world. And I was with someone, a friend from Bainbridge Island the other day, who was talking to me about earthquakes in Central America, and I said I didn't even know. And she said, "Well, of course you don't know if you just read the Oregonian." So it's, anyway, so it's those two things, brevity and brevity about everything so that we can get more of what's important. Thank you. Because in a poem you have that pithy, I mean, I will not forget that Uganda scene of that woman waiting. I mean, that repetition was wonderful, and I got the news. I got the issue, I didn't have to read a big, long article. I know the issue.
Which I read before I wrote the
Yes,
poem,
of
of course. But all the way to the end.
Okay, all right. My name is Noah Larson. I'm a volunteer and community producer at Metro East Community Media, aka Public Access. I thank Portland University of Oregon for their hospitality, and I thank the poets for sharing with us. We need more poets in public school. It is more than tests. And I'll share a personal thing. A tricky question is, what do you want to do? What do you want? Well, I aspire to be a poet on community media, via media. That is my work and my ambition. My son tells me that it is a hobby. It is a hobby. Well, it may be and it may not be. And I'll tell you what it's like. It's like dropping a rock in a well and listening for it to hit bottom. I've been doing this for 10 years and there is no public recognition. I said to my son, I'm becoming invisible, and I am in a lot of ways. And he laughed and he said, ha ha. He says, you're on public access. So I don't know, but I do know this. I have a show titled Noah's News and Views, and it's on Channel 11 Comcast Cable at 10 p.m. And you'll have a piece and a slice of my life, a bit of my poetry on that. And thanks. And for you come across to me as the nicest people. God bless you all. Thank you.
I just wanted to say that one of the greatest joys that I've had is sitting down on Sunday morning with a newspaper and coffee and being able to read articles that are informative, entertaining, and similar to what you said, you don't necessarily find that in broadcast. So I have a lot of respect for the Wall Street Journal, the London Times, the New York Times. I don't know the Oregonian as well, being relatively new here. But I think that we need to support our best journalism, and because it's not only important in our world today, especially with sound bites, but it's also a great delight to be able to read good writing.
If I may say, somewhat self-serving note that we are launching a new master's program in multimedia journalism next fall if we get the final steps of approval in the state system. But the idea is to train the next generation of journalists who are able to work in this new multimedia environment. And I'll suggest to the folks putting the curriculum together that there be some units on poetry. I think as a result of this discussion. Sir, maybe we'll give you the last question.
I was interested by what Don said about how much being able to control the end of the line mattered. And I wondered, is that for purposes of rhythm, or it seemed like you had thought about that a lot. And I wonder if either or both of you would comment on, elaborate on that a little bit.
Well, I'll say a few words, and I'm sure Paulann will have other things to say about this. It was stunning to me when I started trying to write poems, because this is something you never think about when you're writing at a computer. for a newspaper, for the most part. I mean, you don't worry about where the line ends. It happens automatically. I think, we use the term line breaks in poetry a lot. That's a convenient term. It feels a little violent or something for me. But trying to end the line, I think the end is as important as the beginning, I would say, both in a line and in a poem. That's one of the problems with that lopping of the ends of stories I talked about earlier. But I think a line it's a unit of attention, it's a musical phrase, it's a slight shift. Some poets have said it's a line break or the end of a line. The space at the end of a line before you get to the beginning of the next line is, I think Denise Levertov said that's half a comma. I don't know. But it's at least a kind of a pause. And it allows a little silence to break into a poem in an important place. I mean, I think the only thing comparable is in the newspaper is the paragraph. And as you know, when you read newspaper stories, to a large degree, there are so many paragraphs because we're concerned that visually it'll look forbidding to have a fat paragraph or a gray paragraph. There are so many paragraphs that it's almost as if you don't have any paragraphs. I mean, if every sentence almost is a paragraph, then there is no paragraph. So I mean, it's a unit of sound, and it's a unit of emotional attention, and it may, of course, be a grammatical unit too. But it's just one more thing to it's one more thing to play around with besides sentence structure in a poem, and I find it fascinating. I don't quite know the answer yet, but it's something you can't help paying attention to.
For a poet, the line is the basic element of architecture. It is what is very basic to the architecture of a poem. So I agree with Dawn. I talk about lines in terms, not so much line breaks, but in terms of line integrity. What sits on that line by itself, separate from other lines. The music of it, the concepts that are there, that line integrity is very, very important. So each line should have strength of its own. Each line should have music of its own. And of course, you achieve that by where you break a line, where you start the next line. But it's more simply than the way it looks physically on the page, that white space. That is the architecture. That's the very basic element of architecture that you're working with a poem.
Well, with one more? Okay, sure.
When did you start writing poetry, and did you have somebody that particularly influenced you?
I came to poetry very late. And
not as late as I did.
And I think that this is one of the wonderful aspects of writing, whether you're writing nonfiction, fiction, poetry. Writing is very welcoming to latecomers, to late bloomers, and that's indeed what I was. I came to it late, and I started, poetry brought me to poetry, reading wonderful contemporary poems in Saturday Review, Harper's, Atlantic, realizing, at least I thought, the ink was barely dry on them. Here there were people out there writing these wonderful things, unlike what I had encountered in anthologies in school. It seemed like Walter D. Lemire was the only poet that I read much when I was in high school. But here were these contemporary poets writing these poems, publishing them. They just knocked my socks off. I mean, they were fabulous. And I said, I want to do that. I want to do that. And so I started writing pretty much on my own. And it wasn't until I returned to school in my mid-30s and talked Lawson Inada at Southern Oregon University into letting me into one of his poetry classes, his creative writing classes, that I began to take myself seriously as a writer of poems.
Don, how did you come to it?
Well, I was on a journalism fellowship, mid-career, supposedly journalism fellowship, in my late 30s at Stanford University. And I went there to make myself a better medical reporter, to take biology and medical ethics at the medical school and health economics at the business school and all of that. And I did all of that. But at the beginning of the program, at the beginning of the year, this sort of reverse sabbatical from the newsroom, the head of the program said to all of us, you know, this is, for most of you, this is the second time through college for you. And you're not paying anything and you're not getting any credit for this. So there's really not much to lose. You ought to try at least one impossible course. And so a couple of my fellow fellows duped me into enrolling in English 92, the introductory poetry class, reading and writing poems. And it changed my life. In spite of the fact that 2 days after the first class, I went to the teacher's office hours, visited his office, and tried to drop out of the class. True story. And I told him, it's great. It's nothing personal. It's just not for me. Everybody else in the class of 15, two journalists, 12 brilliant sophomores, and me. Every one of them had written poems before, and I hadn't. And I just thought, I'm a news guy. And thank goodness he talked me into staying in the class. So.
I was a Stegner Fellow at Stanford, and those night fellows, that was glamorous. Those guys. Lynn Reed was there the year that was a night fellow there at Stanford, the year that I was there. And those fellowships were really something. I mean, not only did they get the fellowship, but I think didn't they also pay your salary at the same time?
No, don't get, see, this is where...
No?
Everybody was rightly envious of us.
It was pretty flashy. It was good.
Can I just want to, thinking about trying to wrap this up, it's easy for all of us, me included, to make fun of, yes, poems, and yes, the newspaper, or journalists, or the media. And I just want to end on an obvious note, perhaps, but to say that it's really, really hard work to do both of these well. And Paulann, I know, knows that. But it's hard. I mean, I go back to that second quote from William Carlos Williams, where he says to the old woman, maybe his mom, but you got to try hard. Everybody has to try hard. And it's to find what we're talking about here, news in a poem or in any story, any piece of writing, whether it's a blog or a memoir or a diary or a letter or a novel or a short story or a newspaper story, to find the news that, the emotional urgency, that line that Paulann said in her poem that I'll probably get wrong now, but it was something like, but tell me again, please. That sort of urgency that we all want to hear. It's really hard. And also wonderful when it happens as a reader or a writer. And so we all got a lot of work to do.
Well, let's show our appreciation to Paulann and Don. Well, we can continue the conversation outside. The food, the drink is still there. Let me also mention, though, we do many events here at the University of Oregon in Portland just like this for the public. And we have flyers out there that we'd encourage you to take a look at. We have a film series in partnership with OPB called Community Cinema. And every month we show documentaries, the ones that are later shown on OPB on the Independent Lens series. The next one is November 3rd. It's called Deep Down. It's about a coal mining dispute in eastern Kentucky. And so we have a great series through June on those. So please pick up the flyer. Again, it's free. We even provide the popcorn. And then the one other event I want to tell you about is then the week after that, we have a little flyer here. On Wednesday, November 10th, a program on photojournalists reporting the war in Afghanistan. One of our faculty members and one of our recent alums spent the summer embedded with the Marines in Helmand Province, Afghanistan. And they're going to share their stories and also their photos and their video. So again, these are all open, free, public events, and we'd love to see you there and encourage you to be a part of the University of Oregon community, as well as, you know, rooting for the Ducks and football. Go Ducks! So. Thank you for coming, and please enjoy the reception outside. Thank you.